Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 6 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 6 as there's a lot of information I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's talk about diversity in small groups. In our case study, Judy seemed like the perfect group member. Funny, engaging, interesting, and friendly. Several groups were interested in having her on their team. Unfortunately, the one she ended up on began to see her qualities as negatives rather than positives. She was very different from the other very conscientious students in the group. Instead of capitalizing on her differences, they began to resent her. When they got a B on their project instead of the A they were hoping for, they blamed her. But was it really all her fault? The other group members failed to take her differences into consideration and use them to their advantage, and she didn't realize that their focus was more on the task and less on sociability. If everyone had recognized that diversity is essential to good problem solving and that people need to adapt to each other's differences, the group would have been more successful. You might be a little confused about how Judy's problems relate to the topic of diversity. We tend to think of it in terms of culture, race, or gender, and indeed it does encompass those things. But diversity is far more than that. It also refers to differences such as personality type, learning style, and even differences of opinion. If everyone in a group is exactly the same, what do you need a group for? Any one individual could solve the problem. It's the mix of differences in a group that makes the group potentially more effective. The term homogeneity refers to how alike the group members are. The term heterogeneity refers to how different they are from each other. Your group members are certainly alike in many ways. For one, you're all students in this class. You're all also very different from each other. Even people who seem to be very much alike on the surface may find, after getting to know each other, that they have very different ways of seeing the world. The most effective groups have a good balance of member abilities and traits, but if you don't have understanding of how diversity affects the group, sensitivity to the other members' differences, and a positive attitude towards those differences, it's going to be difficult to work together effectively. One of the main ways in which group members differ is their reasons for joining a group in the first place. Of course, in our class, the vast majority of you are here for the first reason, control and achievement needs. You want to get a good grade and learn things that will help you in your career. So naturally, you're going to be more task-oriented. However, some people may also have taken the class because they think it's going to be fun, or they naturally like to feel as if they are part of a group. Those people might think their openness and belonging needs are more important. It's a really good idea not to downplay either of these characteristics, as they are both important facets of a group. In the case study, neither Judy nor the other group members gave any validity to their different reasons for being there. Realize that a balance of socio-emotional satisfaction and getting the job done is needed for the group to meet its goal. Another way in which group members can be very different is in their learning styles. Working in a group requires that members learn new information and integrate and coordinate that information so they can share it in the group. According to David Cole, there are 4 main types of learning styles. The concrete experience style, also known as doers, learn best from observation and participation. They are very much hands-on and they need to actually be there to truly understand something. Reflexive observers, or thinkers, are much more cerebral in nature and prefer to observe from a distance and carefully think things through. They often learn the most from actually writing about what they're trying to learn about. Abstract conceptualization, or studiers, tend to be more solitary learners. They like to read and study about something and are more logical. They're pretty good at researching information. Active participation, trial and error types are very creative. They jump right in, try things until they find something that works. They tend to think on their feet and can come up with something that works in an emergency. Some people, of course, have combinations of these different learning styles, but as you can see, it's a good thing to have a mix of these different kinds of people in your group. Of course, personality differences are often the most obvious differences among members, and sometimes different personalities rub people the wrong way and can be the cause of tension. The main reason for that is that people simply don't know how to work with people whose personalities differ from theirs. Trust me when I say that it's a waste of time to try to get people to change who they are, so you need to work with what you've got in your group. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is one of the most commonly used and is fairly accurate. It looks at 4 dimensions that relate to how individuals interact with the world. How extroverted or introverted someone is. That means whether they're more outwardly focused on other people or more inwardly focused. Or whether they're more sensing or intuitive, meaning whether they live more in the present or think more about what might happen in the future. Whether they're more likely to trust their thoughts or feelings when making decisions. And whether they perceive spontaneously in the moment or tend to judge and plan more carefully. The combination of these different aspects is what makes us who we are. You can certainly take the Myers-Briggs or similar test to find these things out for yourself. So, how do these personality types impact the group? Well, introverts are very good at working independently and may dislike being interrupted. Extroverts are great at interacting with others, but they might be impulsive and impatient. Sensors pay attention to detail, but they might be frustrated if something is too complex. Intuitors, on the other hand, like complexity, but they are less attentive to the details. Thinkers are obviously very logical, but may not notice the feelings of the other people around them. Feelers are considerate of others' feelings, but they may not be very organized. Perceivers are flexible, but tend to be indecisive, and judgers, on the other hand, are very decisive, but often inflexible. Table 6.1 in the textbook goes into more detail about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these personality types, so make sure you read it. Suffice it to say that these differences can cause people to get frustrated. Just remember that the world is full of interesting people who are completely unlike you. No one personality type is better than any other. All have their positives and negatives. We need to be sensitive to these things and be willing to cut each other a little slack when it comes to personality. One of the most obvious ways in which group members are different is culturally. At CSN, we have an incredibly diverse student body. There's no way you can get through school here without interacting with someone from practically every culture. When we say culture, we're referring to the system of beliefs, values, and symbols shared by an identifiable group of people that they've likely grown up surrounded by. That doesn't mean everyone associated with a particular culture is the same. As the disclaimer states, there are just as many differences between the individuals within a culture as there are between different cultures. To assume otherwise is called stereotyping, which is not something you want to be doing to your group members. That having been said, however, there are some general dimensions of culture that have been observed, and it's useful to point them out because they do have an effect on group interactions. First, there are differences in cultures as it relates to independence. American culture tends to be highly individualistic. In other words, Americans tend to value their freedom and independence and tend to think they're right a lot. Other cultures, in particular Latin and Asian cultures, are much more collectivistic in nature, meaning they're more likely to value getting along, agreeing with others, and belonging. Another dimension is power distance. In high power distance cultures, status differences are important and respected, and people with more perceived power are often obeyed and treated differently. Some authoritarian countries have such a structure in place. Americans are a more low power distance culture, as we're less likely to respect someone simply because they have more power and more likely to value equality. Then there's high context versus low context culture. In high context cultures, people don't come right out and say what they mean, preferring to let the situation and nonverbal communication carry most of the meaning. Whereas in low context cultures like America, we hold the ideal that you should say what you think, and we tend to assume that others do likewise. Table 6.2 in the textbook gives good examples of how this may play out in group communication. Just be aware that these differences do exist. We're going to talk a little bit about racial, ethnic, and gender differences in the United States and how that affects group dynamics. In this day and age, that can be a potentially volatile topic, but we aren't focusing on divisions caused by political viewpoints here. Instead, we are focusing on the cultural differences. The major racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. are Caucasian or European Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, and Asian Americans. Again, without going into stereotypes, there are sometimes differences in the way people from these ethnic groups communicate, both with people from their own ethnicity and those outside their ethnic groups. And because they are somewhat different, they can often be misinterpreted. Someone from a culture where they are generally quite reserved might be seen as cold and unfeeling by others. A group member from a culture that prizes expressiveness, on the other hand, may be seen as overreactive. I think the textbook says it best. If you find yourself uncomfortable in an interchange between you and a member of another race or ethnicity, your first impulse might be to blame the other person for making you feel uncomfortable. But you need to stop and recognize that the issue may be because of unexamined differences between the ways two cultures communicate, not because the other person doesn't like you, is angry or annoyed with you, or is trying to get you angry. These issues may not surface at all. People who expect and appreciate differences in group members will likely not be bothered, and may even enjoy interacting in a way that's different from their normal communication encounters. Another very obvious difference between members of a group has to do with gender. The masculine-feminine continuum is often considered an aspect of culture because it is so strong. Masculine cultures value power. Feminine cultures prize nurturing behavior. Now, these are obviously stereotypes. Yet these gender communication rules have been taught and reinforced throughout all cultures. These aspects do come into play in small groups in 4 different ways. In expressive versus instrumental behavior, women are likely to be more verbally and non-verbally expressive and more expressive about feelings. Men are more likely to be more focused on instrumental talk. That's having to do with the task and the work needed. Obviously, that's a stereotype. Women can use instrumental talk too. Men can be expressive as well. The same thing applies with task and relationship focus. Women are assumed to care more about relationships, while men, again, are more concerned about tasks. Then there is the level of forcefulness. Men are assumed to be more forceful in their communication. They talk more. Yes, they really do talk more. They interrupt more. They are more sure of themselves when they speak. Women, on the other hand, tend to be less forceful, and they use more qualifiers like maybe or I think or don't you think so too, rather than I know or I'm sure. Men are more likely to use those terms. And finally, men tend to exhibit more individualistic behaviors and use the word I more, while women are more likely to show more collectivistic behaviors and emphasize the group, and they use the word we more. So although we tend to draw value judgments about communication behaviors, maybe what we need to do is become more aware of the ways in which different cultures and genders communicate. And when we feel like our buttons are being pushed, try to take a step back and recognize those differences as simply that, differences. This does not mean you get to dominate the conversation simply because you're a man, or drop the F-bomb every other word in a meeting because that's how you talk and you're not going to change. It means that you are aware of how your own and other cultures communicate, and that true communication means that everyone is doing their part to understand and to be understood. There's another aspect of diversity that we often deal with in small groups: generational differences. There are assumed to be 4 generational groups born in the last century, and frankly, this book needs a bit of updating already to reflect those born in this century who are beginning to make their way into college and into the workforce. Anyway, these 4 groups have strengths and weaknesses that affect the way they behave in groups. Builders, those born between 1901 and 1945, if they are still in the workforce, and you might find them there, they tend to be very conservative and thrifty. Boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, are confident. They expect fulfillment at work. Depending on their educational level, they can be either conservative or liberal. Whichever they are, they tend to think they're right all the time. They value what they think is the good life. Gen Xers, born between 1965 and 1981, tend to distrust institutions. They are, however, very comfortable with diversity, much more tolerant, and accept competing points of view than their older group members, are comfortable with change, and often very computer literate. And finally, millennials. Often they were raised by helicopter parents. They also value diversity and are highly tolerant. They may be more media dependent than media savvy. They might lack initiative and seem, to other generations, somewhat unmotivated. Obviously, these are generalizations, and not every person in these age ranges displays these characteristics. We're all individuals, But our college is also diverse generationally. I've had many high school students in my classes, as well as people past retirement age. Just like in every other aspect, it's all about understanding the generations that are different from yours and realizing that those differences can be an asset to your group. The value of diversity doesn't just happen by putting different people together in a group. Those differences have to be recognized, valued, and matched to the social and task needs of the group. Mindful communication requires us to be alert, open, willing, and reflexive. Groups need to forge an identity based on who they are as a group, which is why you did the Group Identity Project. Groups are not always totally focused on the task. Sometimes their discussions are about other things. This is what is known in group theory as fantasy, which comes from symbolic convergence theory. Groups create shared meaning through conversation and discussion. Group members come to see many things in the same way. Some even create little in-jokes or special meanings for words that only they understand, or even little rituals like bringing candy to share during each meeting, or things like that. Group fantasy themes that play out during discussions, like the one in the textbook about a group working on a problem who suddenly veer off into a discussion about imagining their college president in a tie-dye suit, that's a fantasy. Then veer it back to their task. Doing that made them laugh, got them to think outside the box, and helped them to feel like they were all on the same page. So what specific things can groups do to bridge differences instead of making those differences seem too big to overcome? Appreciate the value of diversity. Realize that diversity tends to improve group outcomes, but it does take more effort and a different way of looking at things. Openly acknowledge the ways that group members are different. Once you all take a personality test and can see those differences and acknowledge them, it really helps you to see that differences do have merit. Talk openly about how to integrate those differences. Allow the introvert to do research on their own and then bring that information back to the group. Give the task of creating the PowerPoint slides to the extremely computer literate Gen Xer. Everyone has something positive to add to the group. Your group identity can revolve around both the ways you're different and the things you have in common. Use your communication skills to build collective competence. Practice good listening skills. Talk to each other outside of meetings. Use appropriate humor and laughter to relieve stress. Finally, refrain from practices that interfere with appreciating each other's diversity. Negative humor and sarcasm should be avoided. Jockeying for power, talking about group members behind their back, these are all things that are going to undermine your group solidarity. Simply being nice reaps great rewards. Small groups almost always have members who are different from each other in many ways. The most important thing that members can do to transcend and capitalize on those differences is to want to do so. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 6.